Good morning and welcome to IFA's Digital Thinking series, the sixth of our autumn series this year, covering topics of interest to all our member companies and our affiliates in our affiliate program, and indeed guests. We're very pleased in this Digital Thinking series to have the sponsorship of Unifar, our partner with our annual conference for the last number of years. And obviously, because we haven't had an annual conference, we decided to replace it with a digital think series where basically, like in a conference, you'd have the best of thinking and sort of stimulating thought leadership from some of our partners in our businesses to talk about the ways forward and some of the future-looking themes in our industry and in healthcare which affect us all. So thank you again to Unifar for their sponsorship for this whole series, and we look forward to working closely with Unifar again when we look at 2021 and what we shall do there. So this morning we have partnered with Deloitte, a leading consultancy and firm in the world and indeed in Ireland. And Susan MacDonald is going to take forward a discussion with us. She's a partner in health and social care in Deloitte in Ireland, and she's going to take forward a discussion for us on the digital and data future in health. With data is taking center stage, of course, in healthcare now, we're going to examine the rise of digital healthcare delivery models and data-based outcomes. No longer passive observers of this, but both payers and indeed patients and customers, as you might call them, are taking a keen interest in what health data is providing. Payers, from their perspective of wondering, are they getting value and what are the outcomes they're getting for digital or for therapeutic interventions, where they can measure that. And of course, patients are becoming more and more empowered about their own healthcare. And the question is, with this, there seems to be an avalanche of data available, but the questions arise as to what is the quality of that data? What is it telling us? How can it best be used from different perspectives? And how will it change the healthcare delivery models? So this morning, the discussion and the presentation from Deloitte will examine these issues, and I think will be just like our other series, will be very thought-provoking and indeed relevant for how we plan businesses for the coming years. With that, I think I will hand over now to Suzanne, and at the end of the session this morning, I'll come back and say a few words too. But at this stage, over to you, Suzanne.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Oliver, for your invitation to Deloitte to participate in IFA's Digital Thinking series, and thank you for your introduction. As a former medicines regulator, I should say, I've worked in the sector for many years, and more recently I've worked within both the public and private sector in terms of the life and health sectors and life science sectors. And indeed, over the past months, I've had the rather unique experience of working on the National Pandemic Response Team. So I have engaged at a number of different times with quite a few people on this call. Those of you who know me and have met me before will know that I've a real passion for digital healthcare and particularly medtech. And I'm a true believer in the benefits that technology can deliver. And maybe that's because I've been around long enough to know what went before, but certainly the opportunities are enormous in terms of the digital and technological advances that we have before us. I'm really delighted this morning to have three panelists joining us, all the more to make the conversation rich and meaningful. And they're all coming from very different perspectives in the sector. I think that's important. I'd like to welcome Professor John O'Leary, Professor and Chair of Pathology at Trinity College Dublin, the Coombe Women and Infants University Hospital and St James's Hospital. John is synonymous with Surviva, a collaboration led by Trinity College Dublin. And John's research has been very core to HPV developments, both nationally and globally. John leads a multi-investigator group of scientists focusing on a range of cancer types, and he has over 400 publications, and he has also a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contribution to cancer research, amongst so many other achievements he has. And it's been my great pleasure to work with John previously. I'm delighted he's taken some time out of his busy schedule to come and talk to us this morning. So thank you, John. We're also joined by Kevin Higgins. Kevin Higgins is CFO and COO for SilverCloud. Really relevant and on the money at the moment for many people and for the system itself. SilverCloud is a digital healthcare solution providing on-demand virtual mental health support. It's a virtual therapy tool and very much an adjunct to clinical practice in supporting the clinician. Really, really relevant, as I say, at this moment in time. And while SilverCloud is an Irish company, it's had huge international success. So it counts amongst its clients the NHS, and a pretty impressive list of clients in the US, Canada, and further afield. So thanks for joining us there, Kevin. And then also my colleague, Rory Mitchell. So Rory is a partner in our digital practice, and Rory works exclusively in the life sciences sector, very much helping organizations solve some of the more complex issues that we're going to maybe mention this morning. So thanks again, Rory, for joining us. So in terms of format, I mentioned to Oliver at the outset there that I'm not going to kill you with PowerPoint this morning, because I realize that many people on this call will have been murdered with many PowerPoint presentations over recent months. So we're going to keep it fairly light in format. I'm going to talk to you through some of the digital trends that Deloitte will have identified, most likely at the start of this year, more particularly at the start of this year, and looking to the future. For you, some of these won't be new or unusual, but just let's talk through those. And I think particularly given the backdrop to the pandemic, it's not a bad time to stop and think whether these are still relevant. Are they still meaningful? Is there anything different for us? And I'm going to take that challenge back to the panelists after I give you a whistle-stop tour of it. I think very much going back to Oliver's commentary there at the start, so we know for sure that data is center stage, and the demand for data has grown exponentially. And I suppose in terms of access to new digital platforms, big data combined with the latest in terms of predictive analytics and AI, both across the global scientific and medical community, it really is changing the way clinicians work together, both in their research and collaboration, but also in their multidisciplinary approach to patient care, and ultimately in delivering the best outcomes with their patients. And certainly, I think some of the people on this call will be well positioned to maybe talk about their experience in that regard, and hopefully that will be helpful to those of you who are providing many of the products that are in use in the market. So I might just take you through this slide very quickly, maybe just again to provoke some thought, and please feel free to put through some questions into the chat, as Oliver has said. Nothing here in terms of surprises, but on the left-hand side of your screen here, what you're really looking for are the drivers of change. These are global drivers of change. They're not just particular to Ireland, but nothing here that we won't see in our own national strategies here, for example, in the likes of Sláinte Care. Everybody in this call here will know that the pressures and push there is to move from treatment to prevention. And that's certainly a global theme that's coming through in every sense. Much stronger focus on the health and well-being aspect. I mean, it's interesting if you look at the facts, 62 million Europeans are members of fitness clubs, and there's been a CAGR of 5% increase year on year. Now, that figure might be slightly different just right now, given the COVID situation, but it does give you a sense of the interest and appetite for the health and well-being market. It's driving huge growth in the US and globally, and the view would be that will continue to do so. In terms of the model of care, again, no surprises here. So the global push to have less, let's be honest about it, less length of stay in hospital, but also more care in the community, care in the home, different models of care that are reducing length of stay. And you can see that in some of the investments, mergers, acquisitions, and new builds particularly across the US, where they're moving much more to the day hospital as a feature, rather than facilities that are predominantly focused on inpatient care, which of course that would have been the legacy model. And we're seeing that model of care coming through everywhere globally. And again, you'll see that as well in the Sláinte Care strategy. I mean, population health management, it's an interesting one, and it's very pertinent at the moment, particularly when we're talking about how, for example, the vaccination program will roll out for COVID, and the considerations, decisions, the policy concerns, how to look to the protection and management of the population as a whole. Something that I think we're probably still quite immature in, maybe in our own geography. We don't have that much experience just yet, but something that we're beginning to see more and more of in our dealings with governments globally, and certainly more here in Ireland as well. Healthcare budgets is one that, let's face it, everybody on this call has in many ways had to deal with the geography's budget that they're working in. Government still is the predominant payer globally, and having new pricing arrangements, particularly in the context of growing health costs. I mean, health costs have grown year on year, the cost of delivering care, and that, of course, is putting significant pressure on healthcare budgets, which in turn has issues for pricing, reimbursement, etc. Workforce, and funnily enough, people don't always think about the workforce aspect, but there's a global shortage of doctors and nurses, and that's really having a significant impact on organisations' ability to deliver care. And I suppose what it's doing as well, it's getting them to reconsider new options, new ways of delivering care they may not have considered previously. And that, of course, is creating that push towards the digital as well. And then the old chestnuts, the aging population, and of course the complexity and comorbidities that we in the Western world have got to deal with. So, I mean, no surprises there, you know, our diabetes, obesity, chronic heart disease, all of the usual problems that are associated with our developed, particularly in the developing world. I mean, in the middle here, you might say, well, what is that looking like in the centre? That really is around you, the industry, and the challenges then that you're stepping up to address. So if we look at the top there, I mean, the rise of personalised medicines, we're talking here, of course, about cell and gene therapies requiring individualised manufacturing and supply chain. And then, of course, the competitive therapies and indications, so patent and exclusivity expirations, the rise of biosimilars, and of course, an ever more crowded therapeutic area. And then, indeed, the cost and competition for patient and clinical development, something that we might have a chat with our panelists with just after this. So an increased focus on patient enrolment and engagement and trying to meet clinical development timelines. Very challenging, and particularly challenging perhaps in this environment, something perhaps we'll come back to. Also, and it's certainly not least in terms of the challenges you in the life sciences sector are trying to address, is the increasingly health savvy and health aware patient, that digitally connected patient. So patients are requesting support for their overall disease management, and they expect to be full participants in terms of their design of their care and also their ongoing access to medical information. And that demand is growing. And talking to people even recently, you can see yourselves in terms of the demand and interest in data that the public has developed over the last 9 months. We've never really had that before, but it does show and reflect that evolving and empowered patient and the sort of demands and expectations that are coming from that part of the pyramid or from the circle here. And then, of course, we have regulatory pathways. So those of you who've invested much time and effort in regulation and getting your product to market will know how complex that can be. I particularly know from my own history of working as a regulator, and also the amount of data that is required in terms of your post-marketing studies, and of course maintaining the quality, safety, efficacy data, and making sure that you can produce that and keep it current. And that amount of data is currently increasing, the demand for it, the requirement for it, and the regulatory burden. So that's a very significant expense and challenge for the industry to face. Of course, we have complex manufacturing processes and supply chain issues. And again, none more relevant than the one that's been discussed at the moment around cold chain and how those vaccines are going to get to particularly those parts of the world that don't quite have the same controls and infrastructure that we do in this part of the global geography. And then, I suppose, outcomes-based reimbursement. So all of you here who've worked in the US will be very familiar with that outcomes-based reimbursement model. But what we're seeing is that that's becoming much more prevalent in the rest of the world, and particularly in Europe. So we're seeing more and more consideration of outcome-based reimbursement, and governments looking to develop new models or more developed models around measuring the benefits associated with the medicines that they're providing reimbursement for. And that's often at a per patient basis, which is brings its own complexities there. And then last but not least on the circle there, you'll see just the adoption of IoT, or MIoT as it's called, talking about clinical data capture there and disease management in the broader sense. So on the right-hand side of the screen there, you'll see that I have some of the disruption and technologies. So all of those technologies that are listed there are all incredibly relevant and becoming more so. And we would identify them as playing a very important part in the development of the life sciences sector and in responding to some of those healthcare demands. And I think it's interesting because at the top we're seeing there around we're talking about disruption. So you might say, well, what do you mean by disruption? So really what you're seeing there is that the health ecosystem is really changing quite radically, and you're seeing quite a lot of disruption from new entrants into the market. So the tech giants, they want a piece of healthcare, which is really interesting. So they're bringing some of their skill set that are predominantly in that data digital AI robotics market, and they're bringing that into the healthcare sector, and they want more and more involvement and engagement. And you'll have seen this. You'll have seen where Amazon, Google, and others have worked really hard to get more and more involvement in the healthcare market. And that in itself has been quite disruptive. I mean, examples of that might be Samsung has been involved. You've seen Apple involved. Google has been involved. And I mean, if you take, for example, the fact that there are 28 billion users on Facebook, it gives you some idea of the scale of the opportunity and why some of these organizations want to be involved in health. I think as well as that, you'll see telecommunication organizations. So, some of the large global telecommunication organizations have, they've developed their own divisions for healthcare, and they have a particular interest in having more work and having more alignment rather with the healthcare sector. A good example of that, if you're interested in looking at it, would be TELUS, TELUS in Canada. TELUS is a telecommunications provider, probably the largest in Canada, and they also have moved pretty much significant parts of their business into digital platforms for providers, for pharmacy. And it's interesting because it shows that they're effectively seeing their own telecommunications network as being the circulatory system as such, bringing the data around the system, and have continued to be quite interested in moving into other parts of the healthcare model. And then if you look at, say, for example, some of the developments we would have seen with JP Morgan and Berkshire Hathaway, etc., getting involved in healthcare. People are asking the question, non-traditional players are moving into this space. Now, frequently it's because they have these specialist skills and technologies at their disposal that they're able to leverage. But for sure, that's a really interesting component in this changing ecosystem. I think while we say it's disruptive, there's also obviously opportunities for greater synergy. And also it brings new opportunities and new ways of thinking that maybe we haven't thought about previously as a sector. And certainly they're bringing new ways of thinking to the life science and healthcare sector for sure. So on that, I might just take a moment maybe to talk to our panelists, if that's okay. Just going to bring them up there. Thanks, gentlemen. So I've bombarded you with a quick whistle-stop tour of some of the themes. So I'm curious really as to some of your views and feedback. So maybe we might chat through. So quite apart from those themes, I suppose COVID-2 changed the way we live, and I suppose it's dominated our world for the last 10 months. And I'm thinking that COVID-2 has also changed our predictions, maybe for the future of healthcare, maybe in terms of big data and AI, and e-health, and the other digital platforms. So I wondered, are we facing some new or unexpected challenges and new solutions? So I thought maybe, John, maybe I might go to you first of all. So clearly the impacts have been catastrophic in terms of COVID over the last number of months. But I wondered in terms of research, you're very active in the research space. Has COVID created any particular challenges for you and your colleagues? And in fact, are you looking to do something different, or are there new technologies you've had to adopt over recent months, John?
So, Suzanne, thank you. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So yes, COVID-19 has been extremely disruptive to research groups. I think we'd be pretty typical of most research groups in Ireland and in Europe and North America. So we have a mixture of research in the clinical trial space. We've research that is completely wet lab based or based on the bench, a lot of cell based. And then we obviously have dry lab space or context where people are writing up studies or preparing publications, preparing presentations. So the clinical trial space has been completely disrupted. Number one, during the lockdown, people were not available to come into hospitals to take part in clinical trials. But more importantly, there was a reluctance to come into hospitals because of the fear of picking up COVID-19. It was absolutely understandable. And everything that we do in terms of clinical trial interaction with a patient must be safe, must be seamless, and must be secure. And clearly it wasn't safe. It couldn't be seamless because clearly there was going to be a breakup in terms of the continuity of interaction with the patient. And I suppose in terms of security from the digital end, creating the electronic health record for the patient within the trial, that was absolutely fine. But the security around accessibility to clinics and I suppose the whole context of patients having to be tested before they came in significantly disrupted the trajectory of many projects. So I'd have to say in terms of the first level of research, we had to stall, we had to stop much of the clinical trial-based work, including an FDA trial that's currently open here that we're doing. In terms of the wet lab research, that was also disrupted because during the initial level 5 knockdown, all academic institutions asked their research scientists to stay at home and work from home. I think we responded pretty plastically to that and pretty quickly in terms of putting a proposal to university to say that we would divide ourselves into teams. These teams were strategic in terms of their intent, in terms of the projects, in terms of the outputs that were derived. But it also gave us resilience in terms of if one of the teams went down, another team could actually take up the work. And that's worked pretty well. And in some ways, the third element, the dry lab or the paper-based approach, benefited from the COVID-19 lockdown. We got 17 or 18 papers written in that time, got them into really good journals, PNAS, JNCI. So that was a blessing, but it was an unintended consequence of this. But I think what this has shown to me is that essentially, at a global level in Ireland, we definitively need a national digital health strategy. And that needs to encompass both the clinical context of patients coming to hospital, patients in primary care, patients who are involved in clinical trials, and research data that's going to inform policy and practice in relation to healthcare as we go forward. And I have to say, I'm not convinced that we're even within sniffing space of that type of a context. So yeah, it has been extremely disruptive, but there have been unintended consequences. And I think we have got ourselves back. All of our researchers are back now. Our clinical trial protocols are starting to go and patients are being enrolled. But we're 6-7 months behind.
It's interesting, John. And I might just ask Rory. Rory, you're working with a lot of the large life sciences organizations, some of them even on this call. I mean, what we're hearing is that 30% of the trial cost is around recruitment, retention, and monitoring. Are you seeing anything different? Are you being asked, from the pharmaceutical companies that are working with you? Are they looking for something different, Rory, in this space?
Yeah. Hi, Suzette. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. So I think, listen, obviously John's very learned from a clinical perspective, and I agree with everything he said. I think maybe a different slant on what we've been seeing, maybe not that they're looking for anything different, but it's certainly accelerated. So if you think on the commercial side, the ability for farmers to engage with HCPs, like in large parts of Europe, that was essentially disseminated. So there's one study recently, and this was for one brand, for one company, where essentially pre-COVID, 100% of their interactions with HCPs was face-to-face. Now, come April of this year, that was down to maybe 2%. So there's obviously a few people avoiding the work from home, but like a large proportion, over 60% of that sort of interaction went to phone and phone detailing, and then you saw the likes of email and maybe remote detailing. So you saw a big shift, and I suppose an acceleration in that move to different or an omni-channel type approach. But I think interestingly in the sort of data and readouts we're getting now, so post-COVID, you've seen the face-to-face come back, but not to the same extent. It's probably more now like 65-70% of interactions are face-to-face, but you are seeing HCPs looking to engage on different channels at different times. So I think one of the consequences of this now is that actually there is a increasing desire, ability and capability to meet HCPs on the channels that make most sense to them, and provide the content and the formats that is, more suitable and desirable for the HCPs. So I think that's one of the key changes we've seen on the commercial side. And I guess given the nature and sudden impact of the pandemic, naturally a lot of these types of solutions have been quite tactical, right? They've been brand led, or they've been country led, or you may even have multiple solutions for a given brand. So what we are seeing now is that desire and demand to ensure that those solutions can scale in the future, that they're efficient, and that actually they're more of a robust enterprise-wide type solution with the associated operating model. So it's not just the tech, but now how do you bring your brands, commercial teams, the medical legal review, and your reps together in relation to a consolidated view on the HCPs.
And Rory, just you mentioned there the pharmaceutical life sciences representatives and their access to clinicians. Is that something that has had to be totally replaced, I guess, in terms of that level of engagement? So what you're saying is that they're using digital channels. Is that predominantly the only way to access at the moment? And would life sciences organisations feel that that's working for them?
Well, it's certainly, I think, as I said, it's probably come back to a stage now where, well, I suppose it was forced that actually there was no interaction, be it in meeting, physicians or conferences or whatever. They're just non-existent. So we have seen that come back now to a more omni-channel type solution. I suppose in a recent Deloitte survey, 16% of HCPs actually said they prefer to engage on a digital channel post-COVID rather than face-to-face. So we're seeing increasing, I think, traction from HCPs to go, actually, if the capability exists from pharma for me to engage in a way that's more meaningful for me, why wouldn't I use it? So that's definitely something we're seeing in Europe. I think the US is probably a different beast. It's a fundamentally different marketing setup. It's much more direct to consumer, and I think they're more advanced from that perspective. I think what we've seen there is more focus around efficiency and based on all the data that is available. How do you really drive relevant content to consumers and practitioners alike?
Kevin, I might just bring you in here. I mean, digital consultation as a concept has been used, I suppose, pretty much extensively over the past year. It was interesting. I had a look at some of the statistics, and just pre-COVID, so great examples of Jefferson Health in the US. In 2019, it had over 100,000 digital consultations. So I suppose there are lots of great exemplars, to Rory's point, in the US and where they have moved to that adoption. But particularly in Ireland and maybe even Europe, it's been quite challenging to get adoption around that area. And particularly in terms of, I mean, you have a digital platform that's used as an adjunct to therapy, supporting both the clinicians and also the patients. I mean, what are you seeing? Are you seeing something different? Are you seeing less pushback around adoption here in terms of these platforms?
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to join the session and to talk today. What we're seeing, I think, is, historically, there have been digital-friendly ecosystems that we've played in, and that's where we've grown our company. Particularly in the UK with the NHS. They brought out an initiative called Improving Access to Psychological Treatments over 10 years ago. And our product, fell into that sweet spot for the online, for migration away from traditional face-to-face therapy and moving it to initially telehealth, but then now to the cloud with an online kind of platform. And so we've taken, 80% share of the mental health services in the UK to that end over that kind of time period. So I think it's a longer burn. It's no doubt, as we've moved through that journey with the NHS and up to the kind of payer level, the CCGs, we're now seeing that it's not just a mental health front door that we're kind of operating in. It's the need for a platform like ours across number of delivery points within healthcare. In the US, I think, what we've seen is historically innovation-friendly health systems and hospital systems, unlocking budgets for this specific need, and where, they have kind of seen a specific use point for digital mental health care within their healthcare pathway. So I think up until COVID, it had very much been dependent on kind of that innovation kind of angle that the organization would have. Post-COVID or even mid-COVID, right? It's a case of, you know, we're seeing digital transformation certainly being accelerated in terms of decision making, but are the budgets there? Have, you know, the access to budgets, can they be unlocked? And even the contracting and sales cycle process is still taking its time because, you know, resources are deployed elsewhere. There still is a frontline physical nature to the fact that people are dealing with COVID so widespread, and you know, we're not seeing the true kind of delivery impact of it from a new business perspective just yet. We anticipate it; it's coming, and there is an awful lot of noise and inbound interest. And we have seen on our own platforms the uptick has increased because there is a platform there for people to use. It probably peaked in April and May and kind of started to tail off a little. So it'd be interesting to see how it kind of steadies the ship as we kind of move out and numbers start to kind of improve again.
Thanks, Kevin. And Rory, are you seeing anything in this space, particularly, I suppose, around I suppose you could say it's very much that focus around the empowered patient and how the patient has reacted to the online consultation?
Yeah, and I think like it's a sort of multifaceted environment, right? There's multiple elements to it. So I think, you know, obviously we're seeing a desire, maybe a need and a desire to meet the patients where it makes sense for them. So obviously there's been a huge increase in the use of things like telemedicine due to COVID, but at least that shows that there's a desire and a capability there to engage the patients in a different way. I think, you know, obviously the, you know, empowerment of patients is one of the cornerstones of the future of health. I'm not quite sure we're there yet, but certainly we're seeing a shift towards patient centricity, I would say. But that's fundamentally only going to be enabled by the sharing and availability of data. So, I mean, is the willingness there from patients or individuals to share their data? And I think what we're seeing in other industries, particularly in the consumer industry, you know, with the prevalence of wearables, connected devices, you know, you're seeing lifestyle apps like, you know, Strava or Peloton or Zwift, where fundamentally, you know, users they've got all sorts of telemetry in relation to heart rate, power output, weight, speed, and they're willing to share that with various platforms in return for getting an engaging experience. Now, they want to own the data, they need to trust the providers or who they're giving that data to, but they're willing to do that in exchange for a improved quality service. And I think that applies to the life science industry as well. You know, individuals are more aware of the data they have to power that data, and they're willing to share it in turn for a service, but they do expect a service. I think what we're seeing from pharma now is much more of a focus on the individual. Now, be that through personalized medicine, which has got the individual at the heart of it, but I think also in relation to the platforms that are being developed to engage with patients and HCPs. So there's a plethora of players out there in the market now, along with pharma themselves, and even Deloitte's got its own division focused on this. So Converge Health, which essentially provides digital platforms for clinical and commercial. But ultimately, these platforms are providing, you know, better mechanisms for all things from, enrollment, onboarding, access, adherence, education, and ultimately how you then manage all of that data, which is, there's a plethora of real world data being generated. So how do you manage it, safeguard it, derive insights from it? So that is a big focus for pharma. And I think it is having a positive impact for the patients. Now, I think it's still early days, but certainly the intent is there. I'm trying to think what else comes to mind in that space, but I think you're seeing, particularly with COVID, like there's a willingness to share that data within sort of organizations as well. So there's been a lot of partnership focused around, gaining, sharing data, gaining insights, getting through the trials quicker, and ultimately delivering a better proposition for the patient. So I think fundamentally we are shifting in that direction.
Thanks, Rory. John, we mentioned there very briefly at the start there, AI, machine learning, and I know how passionate you are about AI and clinical diagnostics and the impact that AI can have in that space. Your views on maybe recent developments in this area and where you think it's going and the difference it might make based on what you've seen, John.
Yeah, so we've been in the AI space since 1998, so we've had a lot of experience. I just make a kind of an opening comment on all of this. Health sector doesn't really lack innovation. It's the speed of innovation is the problem. But the biggest problem is the scalability of introducing innovation. That's a huge problem. The lack of connectedness is a huge problem. And the fact that if you do anything that's innovative, you're going to execute it in a very fragmented system. And that to me, is a fundamental problem underlying all of this. And I think COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to maybe pause and think about how we do things. How are we going to co-produce this between the patient and the consumer and the those that are commissioning health services and biotech and biopharma. So there's multiple pieces on it that we need to do. But in relation to AI, yes, we believe it's very, very important. So we are the only final publicly funded cervical cancer screening lab in Ireland right now. It's at the Coombe Hospital. So we have been working with artificial intelligence and neural networks since 1998. And things have moved on very significantly from, I suppose, reactive machine learning, limited memory, theory of mind, machines being self-aware, to now, I suppose, in the space of artificial general intelligence and using neural networks. So the reason why we have invested time and resource in this is effectively using AI as a tool, number one, for screening. So we can screen a smear, which is made up of cells on a glass slide. And we can use artificial intelligence neural networks to make a decision to see other abnormal cells on that smear. And I think it served us very, very well. And it's kept us out of a huge amount of trouble. And essentially, the artificial neural network, general intelligence, is following the same type of patterning and processing that goes on in our neocortex in terms of our ability to speak, to reason, to see. So that's logical. But the other end of that is allowing AI as a tool to identify features or patterns. The other thing it allows you to do then is to take that data and interrogate that data in terms of a big data context. And that gives you, I suppose, greater purpose. It gives you greater reliability, and it ultimately gives you resilience in terms of what you're doing. And it's just not alone, say, in cervical screening. This can be applied to any diagnostic modality. And the beauty of AI essentially is that it can become that central linch point in terms of, we just had a discussion there from Rory, wearing peripherals in the community. So community-based medicine, taking big data in terms of the genomics and transcriptomics from laboratories, and then interrogating that, cleansing it, parsing it, and then putting it into manageable chunks that will allow us to define disease traits based on the iterative, integrative analysis that we have done, right? So, you know, everything that we do must be evidential and consequential for the patient. And essentially, everything that we do needs to be a co-production with that patient. So the one thing that I see is missing in all this, AI certainly has revolutionized the screening space for us. It allows us to apply really, really sophisticated technology to make very sophisticated decisions in terms of whether there is a precancerous abnormality present or not. But at the other end of it, it does allow us to integrate all of the kind of the omics work, the biomarker work, the electronic health record of that individual, the full screening history, to essentially define patterns of disease progression. We weren't able to do that before, now we can. So that certainly is very worthwhile. And I think the COVID-19 outbreak gave us pause for thought in relation to how we could potentially extend this. So I think we need to understand that, you know, chronic diseases will make up 40 to 50% of disease management context in the next 20 to 30 years, including that cancer and diabetes and heart disease. And these are diseases that will be managed in the community going forward, not in the acute hospital. So we do need a space to be able to integrate all of the various inputs through AI and through big data networks to be able to define disease patterns, responses to disease, and responses to specific therapies. And I think we're on the cusp of that. And I think we just need to make sure that the innovation doesn't get bogged down in the process of the health sector, which is not particularly good or plastic enough for dealing with innovation. It tends to slow it down. I think we all know that.
And John, it's interesting, I have a question from the audience here, and I suppose it's very much around workforce and workforce of the future. I mean, if you take, for example, digital pathology, just as an example, this is a provocative question, John. Do you see a time where the pathologist role will be replaced with digital pathology?
Yeah, so we have it in histopathology and cytopathology, and it certainly is. It is going to be challenging. Right now, the AI instruments that we're using are semi-autonomous, so they need certainly human input. But I can see over the last year to 2 years that we're moving very rapidly to autonomous diagnosis. And clearly, as the evidence base builds up, yeah, I think jobs may potentially be at risk. But it may also allow pathologists and scientists to do more sophisticated analysis beyond just sitting at a microscope or wondering, is this normal or abnormal? So I certainly, to the trainees that come through our departments in James's and at the Coombe and in Trinity, I try and engender in them saying, look, guys, you're going to be working in a completely different space where technology will be the foundation stone. And you will work with that technology to give the most exquisite and resilient analysis to your patient. So we shouldn't be afraid of it. We should be adopting it.
Yeah, I think John kind of hits on a point there with semi-autonomous. I think we've done with Microsoft and their research unit in Cambridge in the UK, where we're taking some of the real-world data that we've had on our platform. We've had 500,000 people go through our platform now. So there's a huge body of data that we can understand the different persona types, the activities that people have when they're navigating through the content on our platform. And by kind of creating personas, we can kind of start to signpost. And there's a human that, our product works best when there is still a human in the loop. It's just because it's asynchronous, we're able to optimize an organization's resources as a result of that. But if we're able to even optimize the touch points that the human then has, by automating some of them, and this is people's mental and behavioral health that we're dealing with here. So, people are still going to want some sort of human interaction because, it's them at their rawest, putting content into our platform about how they're feeling and navigating through tools to help them through that. So the human implicitly needs to be involved, but to what extent, there's a kind of, that's part of the research that we're working on with Microsoft to kind of see what touch points can be automated.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, to that point, we did quite a bit of work with the HSE on robotics around COVID earlier in the year. There would have been some challenges around robotics, frankly, within the health sector initially, but obviously with the overwhelming demand coming from the likes of the COVID scenario, there really wasn't another option to just throw that many resources in to solve some of these issues. So robotics acted as a good adjunct or assistant, if you will, taking out some of the more routine and probably non-value add activities and allowing, to your point, John, people to focus really using their areas of expertise and their skill set more appropriately. So it's an interesting area. I mean, Kevin, while we're talking about that, in terms of innovation, I mean, cloud is another area that's been traditionally quite poorly adopted, but I've seen much more of it being adopted in the last 9 months. What is your thinking around that? I mean, even the name of your own platform, Silver Cloud, is there a case of more adoption or acceptance that cloud is the way to go in terms of these solutions?
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to, the appetite for digital transformation in healthcare more generally. Certainly in the US, it's on a kind of organization by organization basis, given the fragmented nature of the healthcare system there. And I think, to John's point, I think for Ireland and indeed the UK, it needs to be mandated by the government. It needs to kind of be an overarching strategy that people can plug into, and it needs a label. Be it Scientific Care, be it whatever it is. I think people need to be attached to something that is ultimately going to benefit the citizens of each of the nations, right? So I think what I've seen kind of in some kind of industry reports in the last few months is how is digital transformation being accelerated in an organization? Is it the CEO, is it the CTO, or is it COVID-19 and the checkboxes against COVID-19? I think definitely it has moved on and brought platform delivery, digital product delivery to the forefront. But I think it goes back to the connectivity. Partnerships are going to be key here. Electronic health records, EMRs, they are there, they're prevalent, but you need that interoperability. As a healthcare IT vendor, you need to have that interoperability with the existing tools that are in place. How can you dovetail into the existing? If you're being truly disruptive and trying to bolt something on, it's just going to take time. The rest of the infrastructure has to catch up. So I think it's imperative that solutions kind of work together and come together to either work outside of healthcare or find a way to dovetail into growing at a slower pace.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I've had an interesting question in the panel coming from the audience here. A question, and maybe John, you might like to speak about this one, but the question coming back here is: are we seeing complete convergence of the technology, med tech, and pharma industry? Is it going to actually be one sector? Are we going to see complete convergence? And certainly, the lines for me are certainly blurring between some of the traditional, we've seen it already in terms of even mobile apps that are moving in to become medical devices, or are we taking the next move on? It's going to be just pharm tech, maybe as a sector rather than pharmacy or life science. I don't know, John, any thoughts around that?
Yeah, look, I think that's a very good question. I think that's potentially somewhere we could be going. 5 years ago in our own department, we moved and made a big play, and you know this yourself, in relation to identifying the absolute need for health informatics, which is sadly lacking in hospitals. The whole concept of e-health and connected health. And I think, I have experience from work that I've previously done on SFI-funded projects of where we have been involved in the development of wearable devices and near-patient testing devices that essentially can be used at home. And that the data from these are delivered centrally. And then you have a big data analytics group that will deal with that and then directly interact with the patient. So I think that's a good thing. I think that's where we should be going to. Like ultimately, at the end of the day, and Suzanne, you said this yourself, healthcare systems as they're currently constituted globally are unsustainable. That's the truth. We've a massive shortage of professionals in healthcare systems. It's somewhere in the region of 18 to 20 million currently, and that's only going to get worse. And technology is outpacing healthcare. And you either deny it or you accept it. And I think we should accept it. And we've seen in a limited context during COVID-19, telemedicine consults in primary care have worked very, very well between general practitioners, nurse practitioners, and patients. And in the main, people, while absolutely not satisfied with it, they feel reassured by it because at least they can see somebody at the end of the line and can talk through their problem. So that's on a very, very superficial level. But we need to, I think we need a narrative, and perhaps today is the starting point within Ireland to start that conversation between biotech, biopharma, healthcare providers, and those people that have managerial and logistic and operational skills. I think the dots need to be joined here. I think we need to look at the funding envelope and see what can we achieve. But we can't keep doing what we're doing. And I think there is an opportunity now, given the fact that chronic diseases will completely overwhelm us in the next 20 years. That will have to be done in the community. And it will have to be done with connected communities and mobile communities and the capacity of interoperable data. Now, interoperability can define locally within your healthcare unit, between healthcare units, but also internationally. Of course, the biggest problem that we have with interoperability is GDPR. And I have that problem myself in terms of if we're working with US biopharma or biotech, we have an immediate problem now with exchange of data. And that is certainly going to be very problematic for us here. I think a question has come up online. Ireland has, the top 9 or 10 biopharma players sitting on this rock, and why aren't we better at doing clinical trials? I think that's a very good question. Ireland is completely undersubscribed to clinical trials, and a lot of the problem right now is the red tape and the paperwork that's got to be done. So I think we need to go back and relook at this. I think we need to join the dots, and I think we need to develop ways of smoothing out issues and making it easier for health, biopharma, biotech, and regulators to work together rather than work against one another. That's my view.
It's interesting, John. And again, very much reflecting some of the challenges we have locally. And just maybe, Rory, just to ask you, I mean, you're working on the global stage quite a lot, and I suppose you're working in a lot of other geographies. And to John's perspective there around some of the local challenges we have, or maybe even European challenges around GDPR and data protection, etc. Are you seeing that in some of the geographies you're working in, or does it make a substantial difference depending on where you're working and what digital solution you're being asked for? And I'm thinking as well around some of the questions around those challenges around globally dispersed data architectures.
Yeah, no, listen, it's very much heart and center of what we do. I think, there are a lot of challenges out there. I mean, but there's also a lot of opportunities. Some regions are more advanced than others. Like, I was actually quite surprised to the extent that actually there is more of a holistic view of the patient in certain Latin America countries and the platforms they have in place compared to what you can still get in Ireland. Like, and even just thinking back 20 years ago, like my own father, unfortunately, died from cancer, but like if those memories of going around with paper files from different hospitals, different consultants, you're going, this day and age, that can't be right. But I think from an Irish perspective, that it's, there are limitations and restrictions or perceived restrictions in relation to what we need, how you can share data, what's the intent of that data. But what we are seeing, I think, particularly with the cloud and, big partnerships that we're doing with the likes of Salesforce, AWS, and as I mentioned, Converge Health, which is actually a combination or leverages both Salesforce and AWS, that there are frameworks in place to govern that data and to ensure that you're meeting your regulatory requirements. Now, there are challenges. You can't just share your US data with your European data, but you can certainly put a process in place where you can anonymize that and derive a lot of value, and certainly have a holistic platform with the ability to manage that data segregation. So I think there are challenges, but there certainly are emerging solutions in there which can give you maybe not 100% of what you want, but maybe 80%. But I think going back to one of the other questions there, like at the heart of that is your data architecture. And, particularly with next gen therapies and the platforms that support them, it's not just the patient data, but you need to integrate with your ERP systems and even down into your manufacturing capacity, be that, contracted out or in-house. So how you design your systems and think about the data from the outset, it will determine ultimately the success of those platforms and, I suppose, the quick turnaround time and service for the patient. So I think there's challenges, but there are opportunities, and we are seeing some regions really accelerate and others sort of lag behind, unfortunately. Yeah.
I guess given the scale of the challenge, and particularly around global clinical trials and global innovation in this area, there's really no other way to do it except to have a digital platform and a data architecture that sits behind it. Otherwise, you just can't do it. You just can't achieve the outcomes and to John's point, I suppose, the timeframes that you're looking for. And another, just a question really, and maybe it's to John or maybe to Kevin. Do you think that patients have enough awareness around clinical trials as an option? And maybe this is more to the life sciences spoke on the call more than anything else, but and would digital give them greater opportunity to participate? I don't know whether would that be fair, John?
Yeah, well, look, I think the way we interact with biopharma, biotech has fundamentally changed. So essentially now we have a digital envelope for every patient that's enrolled. Everything goes through that envelope, so everything is completely visible within that envelope. So everything is ultimately tracked in terms of every event that has happened to that patient. That's really, really good. So it's seamless and secure and safe for the patient. I think in general, this is my own feeling, but I think our experience with patients enrolling them into clinical trials is actually very, very good. You know, most people want to take part if they believe that it's going to make a difference to people in the future. And I think most people are very altruistic about that. So I don't think the problem here is an unwillingness by Irish people to take part in clinical trials. I think the problem really is around the architecture of how the trial has got to be set up and all the regulatory issues. And like we went through convulsions, and I use that word very, very carefully, when the GDPR legislation came in. Like the university sector went into meltdown. We started off from the perspective is that all research is finished on human subjects. I heard language like that being used, right? So we'll never be able to do any, you know, investigations in human subjects again. Of course, that all went away as we got clarification and as we sought, I suppose, clarification, some of the nuanced language that was within the legislation. So, you know, you work with the hand of cards that you're given, right? But my guess is that I think Ireland Inc., with its green jersey on, should be using more of the leverage of the biopharma sector here to encourage greater participation in clinical trials. Like we've got some world-class physicians and scientists in this country who are just biting at the bit to say, give me the opportunity to give me the next generation therapeutic. I have been banging away for the last 5 to 6 years that the top 5 to 6 cancers in this country, everybody coming into a hospital should have pre-enabling next generation sequencing to annotate the mutations that are present in their tumor and to annotate what their germline mutation profile is, right? Because all of us, we are effectively a somatic mosaic. All of our cells have different types of mutations, whether we've got cancer or not. Now that makes sense because it makes it more attractive to biopharma than to come to groups of patients and say, look, from your pre-enabling next generation sequencing, you've got this particular mutation, we've got this new product, we want to try this. And then you proceed on with the next generation sequencing notation. I call it DNA, right? Describe, notate, and act, right? And I've been doing this for the last 5 years and nobody wants to listen to it. But they're doing it in the United States. They're doing it in Singapore. They're doing it in Australia. But we seem to have a mental block in our heads that we shouldn't be getting involved in this type of space. So if we had a platform like that, right? Given the density of biopharma that we have, given the data analytic powers that we have now, this is a big data genomics project that essentially you've defined your population from the outset, you've biopharma delivering targeted therapeutics, and see what's happening with those therapeutics. And in cancer, we talk about trunk and branch mutational patterns. So as the therapeutics are proceeding on in that patient, other mutations will arise. And you will be in a position to be able to identify those mutations and truly offer precision medicine. Not talking about it, but actually delivering it. And I'm very passionate about this, as you can see, because I think we are not serving our patients well if we're not doing this. You can go over to Memorial Sloan Kettering and the New York Hospital where I worked, You can walk in the door, and if you've got prostate cancer or lung cancer, you're going to have your pre-enabling next generation sequencing. They will then talk to you and say, look, we have these trials open with targeted therapies. Do you wish to take part?
Yeah.
We're not in that position here, but we should be in that position.
It's a good point. A good point, John. And it shows that we have a good way to go yet. And I suppose some of the questions that we're seeing here around policy and how we have to make that shift, because we're going to lose the opportunity. And as you said, the benefit of having so many of the leading organizations here.
Well, I have two asks from this morning. And the first ask that I have is, we need a czar for a national digital health strategy. They have it in Australia, they have it in New Zealand, they have it in Rwanda. Oh, come on, right? So we need that kind of an individual. But the second kind of an individual that we need is we need a cancer czar, right? To bring the whole thing together. This is a small island. We're akin to the city-state of Singapore, right? And why can't we do what they're doing? I just don't understand.
No, it's a fair point, John. I might, and maybe this will be my last question actually, because I'm conscious of time, but Kevin, maybe bringing us back to some of the challenges we've had over the last number of months. So, I mean, we look at the figures, there's 450 million people globally experiencing mental health problems. I suppose a lot of that has been exacerbated during COVID. Are you seeing that through the work that you do and through your platform and through the wider use of digital platforms such as your own?
Yeah, I mean, we've had significant uptick in interest in kind of taking some sort of content from Silver Cloud, be it from organizations or indeed, you know, patients, users, consumers coming direct to us. I mean, our model is B2B2C, so we're operating with the organization, so we kind of try to point them, if we can, to some of our existing customers. But more generally, you know, the thing that we kind of focused on during this period was trying to help the people who are delivering care. There's an awful lot of people, you know, clinicians, physicians who are on that front line that are going through, you know, this highly enhanced period of mental health stress, where they're having to go, you know, they're seeing things on a daily basis that they just didn't see for the previous years in their career, on that regular basis. So we provided our products, you know, some self-directed content, and have designed a COVID-specific module called Challenging Times, where we provided that content set to the NHS workforce, all of the employees of the HSC, and indeed the employees of all of our existing customers. So we tried to do what we could in this period to kind of get ahead of some of, like you say, the demand that has come across. But our product, you know, works best when we're working with organizations, so we still need, you know, that bridge to kind of help those people who have reached out to us. But yeah, it's phenomenal. We're now, you know, thinking about the impacts on children. You know, for the first lockdown, they weren't in school, they were homeschooled. Everything was happening within one set of four walls. So we've now started to develop content for parents with anxious children. We're seeing our reading age of our content, the need to, you know, typically we deliver to kind of university students and above and that kind of age. So typically it's an adult who has interacted with the Silver Cloud content in the past, but now we're bringing it into the CALMS market, the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Service, and in not only the UK, Ireland, and then indeed pediatric units. So we're kind of down at 12 or 13 years of age at a reading level now, because people are presenting with mental health stresses and illnesses at a younger age than ever before. And I think the stigma, thankfully, the stigma is starting to drop. People are more willing to talk about it, and I think as a result of that, we're turning over big rocks, and we're seeing the need for a solution like ours. John, I'll let you come in.
Susan, one final thing, and you know, in my 30 years of medical practice, whatever solution we bring forward in the health sector must be cradle to grave, has to be, if it's going to have impact. And I think a digital health solution will achieve that. This is going to sound cheesy, but it's absolutely true. Digital health initiative must be of the patient, by the patient, and for the patient. And if they're the 3 principles we use, we'll get it to work. But if one of those principles is dispatched, it's going to fail. You've heard me use it before, Susan.
I have indeed, John, and actually it holds true. And you're right. If we follow that mantra, we can do no wrong. We do it for the right reasons, and it will work. I'm conscious I'm at 5 minutes past 9 nearly, and actually I'd love to spend the rest of the morning talking to the panelists and answering the very many questions that have come through. They've been absolutely amazing. Some really interesting questions. We might come back to the various people who've asked them directly, if that's okay, because we keep you here till lunchtime otherwise. I have to say very many thanks to the panelists for their insights. Really interesting to see that while we have lots of traditional challenges, that the opportunities and potential that's provided by new technologies is really immense, and that innovation is driving some new behaviours, bringing some new solutions and new treatments. And I have to say, for the people on this call, I wish them all very well in their development, their work that they're doing on our current difficulties, let me call it that. And someone said to me recently, it's never been a cooler time to be a scientist, and I think that's probably true at the moment. Again, my thanks to everybody on the call for your attention. I hope you've managed to get some interest and some nuggets from our discussion this morning. And again, thanks for attending. Maybe I'll hand back to you, Oliver. Thanks again, colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne, and thank you indeed, panelists, Kevin, and Rory, and Professor O'Leary. So from a pharmaceutical industry point of view, I love that discussion, and I love that we could have that, and we'd like to see where we can take it, because it has echoed some themes in other parts of our digital thinking series. I think I may have said the last time that there are two things I've constantly heard from general managers of the pharmaceutical companies here in Ireland. One is, yes, they would like to have a predictable way of funding and bringing new medicines into the public and having them reimbursed. And that's, of course, the daytime job. And the second thing that consistently they have said over the years and still say is that we would love if Ireland could match the scale and technological advancement of the investment in the country of our companies with the scale and the technological advancements and adoption of innovation into health services. And we continuously ask ourselves, what can we do to help there? So maybe that has to go from a wish to actually say, do you know what, we're going to have to step up and lead that, because in collaboration with others. We, of course, know, we being the pharmaceutical industry, pharmaceutical companies, know that this isn't a thing just that pharma can do. But there are so many companies, so many leaders within them, leaders such as we have this morning, who all would share that vision. And while everybody has welcomed Sláinte Care, I think we're all very conscious that Sláinte Care is essentially a report about public entitlements to healthcare, and in other words, a very political thing. And second of all, it's about model of care, like primary care over acute. But it isn't really a pathway for how you make Ireland Irish health services innovation rich and adapt to the future and actually be a leading part of that. The willingness, the interest in the HSE, such as I found, is also there. But again, like everyone, they're consumed with the day-to-day. And it isn't a project you can just say, here, get the IT people to do this, because that's not how it works. It's about the business, that the IT people respond to the business needs set for them. So the question is, where the question leave? We have been stimulated this morning again to think that, well, there's tremendous possibility here, and what can we do about it? How do we step up? And I think there's a question for all of us on the call, not just for our panelists, but thank you for stimulating us to do that. And I know, Suzanne, you're passionate about this too. So we have to go and mull this over and think about it quite seriously and talk together a bit more and see how we can not say to government, here, you do this, please, but rather saying, here, we think you should be interested in this, and here's how we can help. And I think that's always going to be a better solution. So that brings to end our session this morning, and it brings to an end our 6 parts digital thinking series. Thanks to all who organised it internally, for all our participants, for all the companies involved. We will have to take this forward next year. Like at the end of a good Netflix series, there always has to be a series 2. We may not, who knows whether we'll have a conference next year or not, but I think we won't be waiting around to see what's available in November. We'll have to build on what we've seen we can do in these sort of sessions, and indeed take them forward into some action as I've just mentioned. So with that, I'll say goodbye and thank you very much for participating, and especially for our thought-provoking panelists this morning.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.